17 minutes. That's all it took. 17 minutes for 12,000 exhausted men. Sunburned, bleeding, half dehydrated, armor scorching their skin, to turn and erase the pride of a 30,000-man army from the face of the earth on September 7th, 1191, on a narrow strip of land between the Mediterranean Sea and the dusty hills of the Levant. Something happened that should not have been possible. The chronicles try to describe it. They talk about courage. They talk about faith. They talk about fury. But none of those words are big enough, because what happened at Arsuf was not just a charge. It was a detonation. For 7 days, the Crusader army had been hunted. Not fought, hunted. Arrows falling like rain. Drums pounding from the hills. Horse archers riding in close, loosing shafts, vanishing before a counterstrike could even form. Men dying slowly. Horses screaming. Shields bristling with so many arrows they looked like walking hedgehogs. And through all of it, Richard of England, Richard the Lionheart, had forbidden retaliation in O charges, in O glory, in O revenge. 3 trumpet blasts. That was the signal. And until those blasts came, any knight who broke formation would die for it. Imagine what that does to warriors bred for attack. Imagine watching your brother take an arrow through the throat and being told to hold your line. Imagine the heat, over 115 degrees, cooking you inside 40 pounds of mail. Your mouth dry, your vision blurred with sweat, your horse trembling under constant harassment. 7 days of that. Saladin believed he understood these men. He had broken Crusader armies before. At Hattin, just 4 years earlier, he had annihilated them, captured the true cross, shattered their power. He knew their weakness, impatience, pride, the irresistible urge to charge. He bled them, he shadowed them with 30,000 warriors, Mamluk heavy cavalry, Turkish horse archers, Bedouin scouts, a living storm that never fully committed, never stood still, never allowed the Franks a clean fight. He thought he was tightening a noose, but he was compressing a spring that on the morning of September 7th, the Crusaders were just miles from safety. The fortified camp at Arsuf lay ahead. Saladin knew this was his last chance. If Richard reached the walls intact, the campaign shifted. Momentum shifted. Confidence shifted as the Sultan did what great commanders do when time runs out. He committed everything. From the hills they came. Not scattered harassment now, but a tidal wave. Drums thundered. Standards dipped forward. Thousands of horsemen surged toward the Crusader rear, toward the Hospitallers who had absorbed the worst of the torment for days. Arrows darkened the sky. The line shook. Men fell, and something inside the Hospitallers snapped. Their master, Garnier de Nablus, could not endure it any longer. 7 days of discipline shattered in one breath. He lowered his lance. Without waiting for the signal point, 300 armored knights exploded forward. For a heartbeat, it was disaster. They had disobeyed. They had broken formation. If unsupported, they would be swallowed and cut apart. Richard saw it instantly. And in that fraction of a second, the kind that defines centuries, he chose. 3 trumpets screamed across the battlefield. The sound cut through drums, through shouts, through chaos. Now 2,000 knights moved as one organism. Not a mob. Not a reckless surge out of formation. Hospitallers to the right. Templars to the left. The royal banner in the center. Iron wedges accelerating. Hooves tearing into dry earth. 8,000 pounds of muscle and steel building to full gallop. For 7 days they had endured humiliation. Now they unleashed it. The first impact was not a clash. It was a collapse. Muslim cavalry, masters of mobility, were not braced for a fully coordinated heavy charge delivered at exactly the moment of overextension. Lances struck at 35 miles per hour. Horses smashed into lighter mounts. Lines didn't bend, they dissolved, and the Crusaders did not stop. Lances shattered. Swords came free. War horses trampled, bit kicked. Knights who had been statues of discipline became engines of annihilation. Every arrow wound, every dead brother, every drop of swallowed rage poured into that forward momentum. Saladin's right wing disintegrated first, then the center, the Mamluks, the elite slave cavalry trained from childhood. try to hold. They were the finest horsemen in the Islamic world. But shock is contagious. Once one section buckled, the fear spread faster than any command could counter it. Richard himself rode at the front, massive, relentless, cutting through resistance. Chroniclers would later claim he seemed inhuman, a giant among men. Whether exaggeration or not, the psychological effect was real. The hunters were now prey. The drumming faltered. Standards wavered 17 minutes after the first full charge began. The Muslim line had collapsed into flight. 7,000 lay dead or dying on the plain. 700 crusaders had fallen, most during the long harassment before the charge. But the army itself stood intact, cohesive, victorious. 17 minutes that shattered the myth of Saladin's invincibility. 17 minutes that turned attrition into annihilation. But here's the real question. How does an exhausted army, outnumbered more than 2-1, baked under desert heat, tormented for a week, hold its nerve long enough to unleash something so precise? Why did Richard wait? Why allow his men to suffer for 7 days before giving the order they were begging for? To understand that, we have to rewind 7 days earlier. Before the arrows, before the drums, before the spring was wound so tight it could tear. An army in half. We have to go back to Acre and to the deadly chess match between two of the greatest military minds of the medieval world. Before there was a charge, there was calculation. Before 17 minutes of destruction, there were 7 days of design. And before that, there was Acre. The city had bled for 2 years. 2 years of siege, starvation, disease, and unrelenting violence before the banner of Richard Plantagenet finally rose over its battered walls. When Acre fell in July of 1191, it was more than a victory. It was a signal to the entire Levant that the Third Crusade was not another desperate European gamble. It was organized, it was funded, and it had a commander unlike any the East had faced before. Richard was 33 years old, young by the standards of kings. But war was not new to him. He had grown up in rebellion, carved reputation from French battlefields, and carried himself with the confidence of a man who believed destiny was something you seized, not inherited. Across the plains, watching from beyond the reach of crossbow bolts and diplomacy, stood the man who had already reshaped the Holy Land once, Saladin T-53. He had spent decades building an empire that stretched from Egypt to Syria. He had united rival Muslim factions. He had crushed the Crusader army at Hattin in 1187. He had taken Jerusalem, the jewel, the symbol, the wound in Christendom's heart, and he had done it not through blind fury, but patience, which meant when Richard arrived, this was never going to be simple. This was not arrogance versus arrogance. This was intellect versus intellect. After Acre fell, Richard faced a decision that would define the campaign. Strike inland immediately for Jerusalem. Bold, dramatic, risky, or secure the coastline first, methodical, supply lines protected by the fleet. He chose the coast to Omni Nights. It looked cautious, almost timid. Jerusalem was the prize, the Holy Sepulchre, the reason they had crossed continents. Why delay? But Richard understood something fundamental about the Levant that European commanders often forgot. Heat kills faster than swords. Logistics decide wars. An army that outruns its supply ships in this climate doesn't conquer. It dies that. He ordered the march south toward Jaffa, hugging the Mediterranean. The fleet would shadow them. Supplies would land daily. Water would be controlled. Movement would be deliberate. When Saladin's scouts reported the decision, the Sultan did not panic. That he smiled, because the 80-mile stretch from Acre to Jaffa was perfect. To the right, the sea, no room to maneuver. To the left, rolling hills and scrubland. Perfect cover for cavalry, a narrow corridor where a column could be harassed endlessly, where flanks were exposed, where a single break in formation could unravel the entire army. It had worked before. Hattin. Crusader impatience had led them into disaster. Draw them into heat, cut off water, needle them until they lash out, then surround and destroy. Saladin believed he knew the Frankish temperament. Richard knew Saladin believed that That's where the real game began, because these two men were not fighting blind. Richard had studied Hattin obsessively. He knew exactly how the Crusaders had been undone. Thirst, fragmentation, rash charges, abandonment of defensive cohesion. Saladin, meanwhile, had interrogated prisoners from Europe. He knew Richard's reputation for aggressive shock tactics. He knew the English king preferred decisive blows. He expected impatience. Each man was preparing for the other's strength, and each was planning to exploit the other's expectation. As August melted into September, Saladin began assembling forces along the coastal hills. Not in one massive, visible formation that would provoke caution, but in waves. Units filtering in from Syria, from inland garrisons, from desert tribes. Horse archers, Mamluks, Bedouin light cavalry, 30,000 by the time it was complete. Meanwhile, Richard drilled relentlessly, not for attack, for endurance, that he restructured the march into a moving fortress. Infantry on the inland side forming a shield wall, spearmen bristling outward, crossbowmen positioned within gaps to fire and withdraw, knights mounted but restrained behind layers of protection, the baggage train tucked between infantry and sea. Every man knew his position. Every unit knew its spacing. They practiced moving without breaking alignment, practiced rotating wounded, practiced responding to harassment without chasing. That IT was unnatural for knights. Offensive by instinct, raised to charge at insult. Richard demanded they become something else than a machine. And then, on September 3rd, they left Acre. The pace stunned everyone. 10 miles a day. Sometimes less. That IT looked sluggish, almost hesitant. But it was deliberate. That a slow march forces the enemy to commit longer, forces them to burn energy shadowing you, forces them to grow impatient. Saladin began with probes. Light cavalry appearing on ridge lines, arrows loosed from extreme range. Testing reactions. Richard gave none. In O charge, in O chase, in O reaction beyond control crossbow fire. The first day ended with casualties, but formation intact. The second day, the harassment intensified. Horse archers swept closer. Drums began to echo through the hills. Dust clouds kicked up deliberately to obscure numbers. The psychological war had begun. And here's where something subtle happened. Saladin expected cracks. He expected young knights to spur forward and rage. That a few did. They died quickly, cut off, surrounded. Their bodies left in view of the column. That a message. This is what happens when you break discipline. But the majority held, and with every hour they held, the pressure inside the Crusader ranks did not decrease. That IT built, like steam in a sealed vessel. Saladin interpreted their silence as strain. Richard intended it as compression. By day 3, arrows fell constantly. Not volleys, constant irritation. A psychological drip meant to exhaust nerves. By day 4, the heat became as dangerous as steel. Armor baked flesh. Water rations tightened. Horses staggered. Still, Richard refused to accelerate. His commanders questioned him quietly. If we move faster, we reach safety sooner. If we move faster, we break formation. That if we break formation, we give him what he wants. The march slowed further. 0.8 miles. Then, 6 from the hills, Saladin watched an army that appeared to be weakening from within the ranks. Richard watched an army becoming something far more dangerous, because every arrow that struck a shield without response wasn't just testing. Disciplined at IT was feeding fury, and fury, when timed correctly, is the most explosive weapon in warfare. By the end of the 5th day, Saladin believed the Crusaders were near breaking. By the end of the 5th day, Richard knew they were nearly ready. What neither army yet understood was that the final decision would not come from strategy alone. IT would come from a single moment of disobedience. And when it came, it would force Richard to choose between disaster and immortality. By the 6th day, the Crusader army no longer looked like an army. That IT looked like something dragged out of fire. Shields were split and studded with arrows, so thick they barely showed their painted crosses. Horses limped, flanks streaked with sweat and blood. Knights who had begun the march polished and proud now rode with faces blistered, lips cracked, eyes hollow from sleepless nights under harassment. And still the drums from dawn to dusk. The Muslim war drums rolled across the hills like distant thunder that never broke. It was not random noise. It was rhythm. It was pressure. It was the constant reminder that they were being watched, measured, toyed with. Saladin had escalated, and no longer content with distant harassment. He ordered coordinated strikes against the rear and van. Waves of cavalry would surge and closer than before, not committing fully, but close enough for sabers to flash, close enough for insults to be shouted in Arabic, close enough for crusaders to see the faces of the men killing them. The Hospitallers bore the worst of it. They marched at the front of the column along the inland side, absorbing the heaviest arrow fire. Warrior monks, disciplined, hardened, but even iron bends under enough heat. Master Garnier de Nablus rode at their head, silent most of the time now. He had lost brothers every day, men who had sworn the same vows, men he had trained beside, and for 6 days he had obeyed Richard's command in "O charge." Not yet, but the murmurs were growing. Sergeants whispered that morale was thinning. Younger knights spoke openly of honor and shame. They were not afraid of dying. That was never the issue. They were afraid of appearing weak, of allowing themselves to be mocked without answer. Saladin sensed it that on the 6th day, he committed more elite cavalry closer to the line. Mamluks rode within taunting distance, loosing arrows almost point blank before wheeling away. Some struck at individual knights with sabers and retreated before counterblows could land. That a Hospitaller took an arrow through the visor slit and fell backward off his horse without a sound. Another's mount collapsed screaming, legs shredded. Still, Richard did not give the signal. He rode the center, moving constantly, visible to as many men as possible. His presence alone mattered. Armor gleaming despite dust. Standard held high. He spoke little, but when he did, it carried hold. That was the word repeated, hold, because he understood something Saladin was beginning to forget. The Muslim army was expending energy too. Horse archers burned strength. Cavalry cannot harass endlessly without fatigue. Supplies thin. Coordination strains over days of constant maneuvering. Even confidence can become impatience. And impatience in a commander is lethal. That on the evening of September 6th, Saladin convened his emirs. The Crusaders were close to Arsuf now. 5 miles, perhaps less. If they reached the fortified woodland and camp intact, the opportunity would evaporate. The Sultan had harassed them for nearly a week. The casualties had mounted, but the line had not broken. He made the decision. Tomorrow, full engagement, and more drizzle than a storm. He would strike the rear hard enough to tear it open, roll the column inward, crush the knights in confined terrain before they could coordinate a countercharge. That IT was bold, that IT was necessary. And it was exactly what Richard had been waiting for. That night in the Crusader camp, there was no triumph, no celebration of survival. Only silence. Men too tired to speak, too dehydrated to pray loudly. Some slept in armor because removing it required energy they no longer had. Richard gathered his commanders under torchlight. He must attack tomorrow, he said quietly. Not a guess, at a certainty. He cannot allow us to reach Arsuf. The knights looked at him, waiting for what they had been craving for 7 days. He did not promise vengeance, that he did not promise glory. He simply repeated the signal. 3 blasts. If anyone charged before that, they would die unsupported. If they waited, truly waited, the moment would come. Dawn broke on September 7th like every other dawn. Blinding sun over flat coastal plain. Sea glittering to the right. Hills to the left. But there was something different in the air. Density. From the hills, instead of scattered riders, came formations, standards visible in clusters. Cavalry massing in depth. Drums louder. Not harassment now. Orchestration. Saladin had committed his entire host point 30,000, the right wing under Taqi al-Din, center anchored by Mamluk elite under Saladin's direct oversight, left wing sweeping wide to envelop, reserves held back to exploit collapse. The Crusader column formed up as drilled, infantry shields locked, crossbowmen ready, knights mounted but restrained. T9 in the morning, The first wave hit, not probing, hammering. Thousands of arrows launched in coordinated volleys. The sky darkened properly this time. Shields rattled. Horses shrieked. Infantry stumbled but locked tighter. Then the cavalry pressed in close, too close. Sabers slashed at the rear ranks. A breach nearly opened in the Hospitaller line as a concentrated strike targeted their banner. Garnier de Nablus felt something snap inside him. 7 days of swallowed fury. 7 days of watching men die. 7 days of discipline stretched like wire. And now elite Muslim cavalry was within striking range, taunting, cutting, daring them. He looked ahead, and oh trumpet, he looked his left. Another knight fell. The decision was not rational that IT was human. I can bear this no longer. He lowered his lance and spurred forward. 300 Hospitallers followed instantly. For a heartbeat, time froze. They had disobeyed. If Richard held to his plan, they would be isolated, surrounded, destroyed, and the entire Crusader column might unravel trying to rescue them. From the center, Richard saw the movement, dust rising where it shouldn't, the Hospitaller wedge breaking outward at in that sliver of a moment. He had two choices: let them die and preserve discipline, or commit everything and transform a breach into a weapon. This is where greatness lives, in decisions measured in seconds. Richard did not hesitate. He turned to his trumpeters, and the sound that followed would echo through. Sentries point 3 long blasts. Across the column, knights who had been holding rage like a coiled serpent felt release. Reins tightened. Lances lowered. 2,000 armored riders surged forward as one. Not chaos. Formation. The trap had sprung, and Saladin, who believed he was delivering the killing blow, was about to discover he had just stepped into the center of it. The trumpets were still echoing when the ground began to shake. Not metaphorically. Physically. 2,000 destriers, war horses bred for collision, surged forward in unison. These were not light desert mounts. These were massive animals, trained to charge into spear walls, trained to bite, to kick, to trample. Each one carrying a knight wrapped in iron. 40 pounds of mail, helm locked, shield tight, lance leveled. For 7 days they had endured. Now they accelerated. Saladin's commanders saw the Hospitallers break first and believed it was the fracture they had been waiting for. Orders went out to envelop them. Muslim cavalry began tightening inward, confident the isolated knights would be swallowed. Then the second wave hit. The full Crusader cavalry. The Templars on the left wheeled outward in perfect alignment. Richard's household knights drove straight down the center. The Hospitallers, already in motion, became the right hammer of a 3-headed blow. What made it unstoppable was not rage. It was cohesion. The wedges did not blur into chaos. Even at full gallop, spacing held. Lances angled identically. Shields overlapped where they could. It was not an explosion. It was a directed impact. The first collision happened at speed. 35 miles per hour to knight, horse, and armor together weighing close to half a ton. Multiply that by hundreds, striking in tight formation. Muslim cavalry had fought Crusader charges before, but those had often been fragmented, premature, easy to bend and scatter. This was different. This was 7 days of restraint released in perfect synchronization. Lances struck first. The sound was not metal on metal. It was wood shattering. Bone cracking. Air punch from lungs. Horses screaming as momentum transferred through flesh. The lighter cavalry on Saladin's right wing did not bend. They disintegrated. Riders were thrown from saddles. Horses flipped. Gaps opened instantly. But here is what most people misunderstand about medieval charges. The lance impact is only the beginning. When the shaft splintered, the knights did not slow. They drew swords mid-motion. Some dropped broken lances and leaned low to cut at exposed necks and arms. The war horses themselves became weapons, trampling men who had fallen into the dirt. The Hospitaller wedge punched clean through Taqi al-Din's forward elements, and instead of scattering into pursuit, they reformed inside the breach. That discipline, that refusal to dissolve into individual duels, multiplied the damage. At the same time, Richard's central wedge smashed into the Mamluk corps. The elite, the veterans. The men who had stood unbroken at Hattin. For a moment, they held. The Mamluks were. Not militia. They were trained from childhood, conditioned for loyalty and skill. Their armor, though lighter, was not weak. They countercharged. Sabers flashed. Arrows loosed at near point-blank range. But shock is not just physical. It is psychological. For 7 days, Muslim cavalry had been the aggressor. Always moving, always choosing distance, always dictating tempo. In one heartbeat, that advantage vanished. They were now stationary targets absorbing concentrated mass. The ground churned into dust so thick that visibility shrank to yards. Drums faltered. Orders became lost in the roar of hooves and screams. And then something subtle happened. Men began to turn their horses, just slightly at first. Repositioning, reassessing. Then more. A ripple of backward motion, and ripples in cavalry formation spread faster than spoken commands. Richard was visible in the chaos, a towering figure in gleaming armor, striking left and right. Chroniclers would later exaggerate, claiming he cut down enemies with impossible strength. But even stripped of legend, his presence mattered. Soldiers fight differently when their king is physically in front of them. He was not directing from safety, he was in the collision. The Templars, seeing the right and center break through, angled inward. Their charge hit the already faltering flank from the side. Now it was not a line. It was a collapse. Saladin tried to rally reserves. Signals went up. Standards dipped forward. But cavalry panic spreads like fire in dry grass. Once the forward units broke, men in the rear saw riders fleeing toward them. Dust clouds shifted direction. Shouts changed tone. Confidence evaporated. And when cavalry loses confidence, it loses cohesion. In less than 10 minutes. What had been a coordinated encirclement became fragmented survival. The Crusaders did not pursue recklessly at first. They continued forward momentum, cutting through organized resistance, widening the rupture. Then the second wave of devastation began. Pursuit. Knights who had held fury for a week now rode down, fleeing riders across open ground. Muslim cavalry, built for mobility, could outrun infantry, but not fresh, heavy horses already at full gallop inside broken formations. Mamluks who dismounted to form defensive knots were trampled or cut apart. High-ranking emirs, identifiable by ornate armor and standards, became targets. Killing them wasn't just tactical. It amplified psychological collapse. Saladin himself came dangerously close to the front as he attempted to stabilize the center. And for a moment, a brief, terrifying moment, Richard's forward elements drove so deep that the Sultan's position was threatened. His personal guard closed ranks around him. But the army around them was dissolving 17 minutes after the first unified impact. The field had changed completely. Where there had been 30,000 organized warriors, there were now streams of men fleeing toward the hills. Horses riderless, standards abandoned, drums silent. The killing did not stop instantly. Knights rode 3 miles in pursuit before exhaustion slowed mounts. Crossbowmen advanced methodically, firing into clusters of retreating cavalry. Only then did Richard sound recall. And that might be the most important moment of all, because victory intoxicates, and intoxication destroys discipline faster than fear ever could. But Richard pulled them back, reformed them, held them together even in triumph. When the dust finally began to settle, the scale of what had happened became visible. Muslim bodies lay in rows where wedges had cut through. Piles of dead marked the points of heaviest collision. Horses wandered, range trailing. Armor glinted in the sun where men had fallen. 7,000 dead, by conservative estimates 17 minutes. The Crusader losses were heavy from the days of harassment, around 700 total, but during the charge itself, remarkably light. That it should not have been possible. Numerically superior, strategically positioned, psychologically confident, and yet undone, not by strength alone, but by timing. Saladin had planned to break discipline. Richard had weaponized it. But here's where the story becomes even more fascinating. because after destroying the core of Saladin's field army, Richard refused to chase him down, that he refused to annihilate what remained. And that decision, just as much as the charge, reshaped the entire war. When the noise stopped, it felt unnatural. For 7 days, the Crusaders had marched to the sound of drums and arrows. For 17 minutes, the world had become hooves, steel screams. Now there was wind, just wind off the Mediterranean, carrying dust and the metallic scent of blood. Knights sat in their saddles, breathing like hunted animals. Horses trembled, foam drying white against dark hides. Some men stared forward, swords still in hand, as if the enemy might reform out of the haze. But they did not. Across the plain, bodies lay in lines, not scattered randomly, but in terrible geometry. Where each wedge had struck, the dead formed corridors. Broken lances marked the first impact points. Trampled ground showed where panic had turned into rout. 7,000 by most counts. Perhaps more to high-ranking emirs were found among them, identifiable by ornate armor and silk standards crushed into dust. The Mamluk elite, the pride of Saladin's cavalry, lay in heaps where they had tried to hold. For the first time since Aten, the myth cracked, because before this day, Muslim armies had believed something fundamental, that if they avoided being pinned, if they controlled distance and tempo, the Frankish knights could always be worn down to Arsuf. They had been the ones pinned. They had committed fully and been broken. Saladin had not been captured. His personal guard had managed to extract him from the collapsing center. But he had seen it. He had felt it. The moment when confidence drained from his ranks like water from a shattered vessel, that he knew what this meant. Armies are not just numbers. They are belief. And belief had just been wounded. Back among the Crusaders, the counting began. Richard ordered an immediate reformation. No looting free-for-all. No dranquen celebration. Units reassembled under banners. Wounded were pulled inward. Water distributed with discipline. Some knights protested. They wanted pursuit. They wanted to finish it that Saladin's army was running. The road to Jerusalem seemed open. Why stop now? Why not ride them into the hills and crush what remained? But Richard had not survived decades of war. By confusing victory with opportunity, he looked at his men. They were victorious. They were also exhausted beyond reason. 7 days of marching in brutal heat. Constant arrow fire. Horses pushed to the edge of collapse. Crossbow bolts nearly spent. Infantry battered and dehydrated, but a pursuit in a broken terrain against a still numerous enemy who knew the hills intimately could reverse everything. Victory can turn to disaster faster than defeat can turn to hope. That, oh, he did the unexpected. He halted. He ordered the army to continue the planned march to Arsuf, not chase the fleeing host. That decision stunned both sides. Saladin expected pursuit. He braced for annihilation. Instead, he saw the Crusader army reform, controlled, methodical, advancing towards safety rather than glory. That it was a second demonstration of discipline, not just in battle. But after it.by evening, the Crusaders reached the woodlands near Arsuf and established secure position. Fires were lit carefully. Guards posted. Wounded tended. Dead buried where possible. There was no wild celebration. Only exhaustion and quiet realization. They had done something extraordinary. News spread faster than cavalry. Within days, across the Levant, word traveled that Saladin's army had been shattered in open battle. That the Franks had charged and not been broken. That the Mamluks had fallen in great numbers. Garrisons that had once felt secure now hesitated. Jaffa, which Saladin had expected to defend fiercely, opened its gates without resistance when Richard approached. Ascalon began reconsidering its position. The psychological balance shifted. Before Arsuf, Saladin had been the unstoppable unifier who crushed Crusader armies and reclaimed Jerusalem. After Arsuf, he was still formidable, but not invincible. And in medieval warfare, invincibility was currency. Lose it, and alliances tremble. But the deeper consequence was strategic. Richard had proven something critical. Heavy cavalry, properly restrained and perfectly timed, was still the most devastating shock. Weapon on the battlefield. For years, lighter, Mobile forces had dominated through harassment and attrition. Many believed the age of the armored knight as decisive force was fading in the Levant. Arsuf reversed that perception. That IT showed that discipline could counter mobility, that patience could counter numbers, that endurance could become a weapon sharper than any sword. Yet victory at Arsuf did not deliver Jerusalem. That is the part many overlook. The road lay open in theory, but the reality of siege warfare, supply chains, and divided crusader leadership complicated everything. Richard understood that one brilliant field victory did not guarantee the reclamation of the Holy City. And here is where the story deepens. Because Saladin, shaken but not destroyed, adapted, he avoided large open engagements afterward. He shifted toward fortification, maneuver, negotiation. He learned from the shock. Great commanders survive defeat by evolving. Richard had shattered his doctrine once, he would not allow it twice. The war continued. Sieges, negotiations, standoffs under the relentless Levantine sun. But Arsuf remained the hinge. The moment where numbers lost to nerve, where 7 days of restraint purchased 17 minutes of devastation. And where two legends proved something uncomfortable about war. Sometimes the hardest act is not charging that IT is waiting that we're not at. The end yet. Because the final part of this story isn't just about who won the field. It's about what Arsuf changed forever in the art of warfare, and why those 17 minutes still echo through military strategy even today. Victory should feel clean. Arsuf did not. Yes, the Crusaders had shattered Saladin's field army. Yes, the numbers were staggering. Yes, the myth of invincibility had cracked. But when night settled over the camp near Arsuf, there was no sense that the war was finished. Because Richard understood something most of his knights did not. They had won a battle. Saladin still had an empire. Egypt still fed his treasury. Damascus still armed his cavalry. Jerusalem still flew the crescent. And the desert still belonged to him. Within days of Arsuf, Richard secured Jaffa. The port became the new anchor for Crusader operations. Ships unloaded grain, wine, replacement crossbow bolts, spare horses. The army finally rested without arrows raining from the hills. But rest brought something dangerous: thought. Knights who had survived 7 days of torment and a 17-minute inferno began asking the question they had crossed continents to answer. When do we march on Jerusalem? The holy city was barely 60 miles inland. 60 miles. After everything they had endured, it felt almost insulting that it was still out of reach. Richard rode inland with reconnaissance forces, testing routes, examining terrain. Winter rains would soon turn roads to mud. Supply lines would stretch thin. Saladin's remaining forces, though battered, could still shadow and harass an inland march far more effectively than along the coast. And Saladin was not idled in the weeks after Arsuf. The Sultan worked feverishly. He rallied survivors, reinforced fortifications, sent messages across his territories calling for renewed commitment. And perhaps most importantly, he reframed the narrative. Yes, there had been defeat, but not destruction, that he emphasized Richard's refusal to pursue as weakness rather than discipline. He reminded his emirs that the Franks had not retaken Jerusalem, that Islam still held the holy city. That one battle did not undo Hattin. Belief can be rebuilt, but it takes careful hands, and Saladin had them. Meanwhile, inside the Crusader camp, a different tension was growing. Richard was not commanding a unified national army. He led a coalition: English, Norman, French, Poitevin, Sicilian, Crusader states from the Levant. Rivalries simmered beneath the surface. Philip II of France had already departed the Holy Land months earlier, leaving political friction in his wake. Every decision Richard made had political weight. If he marched inland and failed, he would lose everything. If he delayed, he risked morale. And Jerusalem was not just a city. It was an idea powerful enough to make rational strategy feel like cowardice. By early 1192, Richard made the bold move that he marched toward Jerusalem. Slowly, cautiously, the army advanced inland under winter. Skies, mud-sucked boots, rain-soaked armor, supply wagons bogged down. Saladin's cavalry reappeared on distant ridges. not attacking recklessly, just watching. Always watching. The Crusaders reached within sight of Jerusalem's outer region, and then Richard stopped. He climbed a vantage point where the holy city's walls could almost be seen. Almost. Chroniclers later claimed he refused to look directly at it, not out of indifference, but because he knew that if they took it, they could not hold to capture Jerusalem required a siege. To hold Jerusalem required supply routes deep inland, constant reinforcement, protection from counterattack. Saladin's forces, even diminished, could isolate the city once the Crusaders' fleet support was out of range. Richard faced the hardest command decision of his life: capture glory and risk annihilation, or preserve the army and deny the symbol. He chose preservation. The army withdrew from the outskirts of Jerusalem without ever laying formal siege. The disappointment was crushing. Knights wept openly. Some raged. Some accused Richard of lacking faith. But Richard was thinking beyond emotion, because another storm was brewing, one that would test his brilliance again. Saladin, recognizing that Richard would not overextend, shifted strategy entirely if he could not break the Crusader army in open battle. He would break their foothold. In July 1192, Saladin struck Jaffa, swiftly, brutally. The city that had opened its gates months earlier fell under sudden assault. Muslim forces breached defenses before Crusader reinforcements could react. Panic spread. Crusader garrisons were overwhelmed. And this time, Richard was not marching methodically along the coast. He was at sea. When news reached him that Jaffa was falling, he did not deliberate for days, that he acted instantly. With a handful of ships and a fraction of his army, Richard sailed straight toward the besieged city. What happened next would become legend. Outnumbered, landing under fire. Richard leapt into waist-deep water in full armor, sword in hand, rallying a tiny force against thousands already. Inside the city, that it was not RZUF, it was something different. Desperation instead of patience, speed instead of compression, and once again, shock. The Muslim forces inside Jaffa had not expected a direct amphibious counterattack. They had not expected Richard himself to lead it. They had not expected a king to wade in his surf and charge before his men had even formed ranks. Panic spread again, not because of numbers, but because of surprise. Richard recaptured Jaffa in a matter of hours, and when Saladin launched a counterattack days later, the two armies clashed in another fierce engagement outside the city walls, smaller scale than Arsuf, but just as intense. Richard personally led charges with barely a handful of knights against waves of cavalry. At one point, he reportedly fought surrounded, swinging his sword so ferociously that Muslim chroniclers themselves recorded admiration. And here is something extraordinary. During that clash, Saladin noticed Richard's horse had been killed. He sent 2 fresh horses to him. Not mockery. Respect, because this was no longer simply Crusader versus Muslim. It was commander recognizing commander. Warriors recognizing greatness in an enemy. That exchange tells you everything about the level at which this war was being fought, not just with steel, but with legacy. After Jaffa, both men understood something. Neither could decisively destroy the other without risking everything. Richard could win battles. Saladin could endure campaigns, and both were running out of time. Richard faced political instability at home in England. His brother John plotted. Philip of France threatened his continental lands. Every month in the Levant weakened his position in Europe. Saladin's empire, though resilient, was strained by constant mobilization and internal pressures. In September 1192, almost exactly 1 year after Arsuf, negotiations solidified. The Treaty of Jaffa. Jerusalem would remain under Muslim control, but Christian pilgrims would have safe access. The Crusaders would retain a narrow coastal strip. Neither side achieved total victory. Neither side achieved total defeat. But Arsuf remained a moment where the balance shifted, where Saladin learned caution in open battle, where Richard proved discipline could overturn numbers, and where 2 of the greatest military minds of the medieval world tested each other to the limit. Yet here's the deeper thread connecting it all. Arsuf was not just about cavalry. It was about timing. And that principle, endure, compress, unleash at the perfect moment, would echo far beyond the Crusades. Centuries later, generals would study similar concepts. Lure overextension, absorb pressure, strike concentrated. From European battlefields to modern mechanized warfare, the lesson remains the same. Patience is not weakness, that it is preparation. And sometimes, the most devastating weapon on earth is not steel, that it is restraint, that we still have a long way to go. Because the final arc of this story isn't just about Richard and Saladin, that it's about legacy, about what happens after legends leave the battlefield, and how 17 minutes in 1191 still whisper through military history. The city did not fall in a single night. It unraveled. First came the rumors, whispers drifting through taverns and market squares. Caravans burned beyond the eastern hills. A garrison that never returned. A provincial governor who declared loyalty to someone else, though no one seemed certain who that someone truly was. The king listened. He had ruled for 30 years. He had won wars, signed treaties, married his daughters into rival courts. He understood steel and ink equally well. But this was different. This was not invasion. It was erosion. And erosion was far harder to fight. Far to the south, beyond the river valleys, a young commander named Aram was rising. He had not inherited a throne. He had not been born into gold. He was the son of a minor officer, raised in frontier forts where walls were thin and winters were cruel. He had learned early that loyalty is earned, not demanded. While the old king balanced alliances, Aram built something else. He built belief, that he spoke to farmers about fair taxes. He promised merchants protection without crippling levies, that he allowed conquered soldiers to join his ranks instead of executing them. And slowly, banners began to change, not because of fear, because of hope. The first clash between the old world and the new came at the Pass of Kerith. The king's general expected rebellion to scatter at the sight of armored cavalry. Instead, Aram's forces held formation. They used terrain. They anticipated maneuvers. They did not fight like peasants. They fought like a vision. When the dust cleared, the royal army had withdrawn, not defeated, but shaken. Inside the capital, doubt spread faster than plague. Counselors whispered that perhaps Aram should be offered a governorship, a marriage alliance, a seat at court. Bring him inside the system, they urged. Make him dependent. The king knew better. Men like Aram did not want seats at old tables. They wanted new ones built. Winter came harsh and early. Supply lines failed. 2 provinces openly declared independence. The treasury, once swollen with tribute and silver, began to thin. Mercenaries demanded payment in advance. Some switched sides when it did not arrive. Yet still, the king did not surrender. He rode north himself, appearing before villages and forts, reminding them of shared victories, of roads built, of enemies repelled, of stability. For many, it worked. For some, it was too late. Then came the turning point, not on a battlefield, but in a burned-out monastery at the edge of the realm. Aram requested a meeting in guards within the walls and hidden archers, just 2 leaders and the weight of a dying empire between them. They spoke for hours about power, about legacy, about the difference between ruling land and ruling people. The king accused Aram of ambition disguised as virtue. Aram accused the king of stability that had grown stagnant, neither fully wrong, neither entirely right. When they left that monastery, there was no treaty signed, but there was understanding. Months later, the capital gates opened, not to fire, not to slaughter, but to negotiation. The old king abdicated, not because he was forced to, but because he understood something few rulers ever grasp. An empire survives not by clinging to the past, but by allowing the future to breathe. That he did not die in chains, that he retired to a coastal fortress overlooking the sea he had once dominated. And Aram entered the city not as a conqueror, but as a reformer. But here's where most stories would end. This one does not, because Aram soon discovered what the old king had known all along. Holding power is harder than seizing it. The same provinces that once rallied to hope now demanded immediate change. Rivals within his own council began building factions. Trade networks disrupted by civil war took years to rebuild. Former allies questioned his authority the moment victory was secured, and beyond the eastern desert, another banner was rising. History does not pause that IT evolves. Aram would face rebellions of his own. He would sign compromises he once swore he never would. He would defend borders with the same iron hand he once criticized, and one day, a young commander somewhere on the frontier would begin speaking of fairness, of reform, of renewal. The cycle would begin again, because empires are not destroyed by swords alone. They are reshaped by ideas, and ideas, once born, cannot be besieged beyond the eastern desert. Something was moving, not an army. Not at first. IT began with traders. Caravans that once carried spices and dyed silks now carried stories. Tales of a confederation of tribes uniting under a single banner. Of wells fortified. Of riders who could cross the dunes faster than any royal courier. Of a leader who refused tribute, but demanded respect. They called him the Falcon of the Sands. His true name was Malik, that he was not born to power either. But unlike Aram, Malik did not promise reform, he promised destiny. For generations, the desert tribes had fought among themselves. Over water, grazing lands, honor. They were fierce but divided. Malik changed that. He did not conquer the tribes, that he unified them. He declared the desert sacred, indivisible, eternal. He established shared laws where once there had been only blood feuds. He created a council of elders, but kept final authority in his own hands. Unity through identity, strength through belief, and once unity was secured, he looked outward. Aram received the first report during Spring Council. A caravan was stopped. Merchants detained. New toll demanded. Aram frowned. Toll? He asked. Yes, the advisor said. Not payment for passage. Recognition. Recognition. The desert was no longer a void between empires. IT was becoming one. Malik's forces did not invade in waves. They tested swift raids on border outposts, disruptions of trade routes, strategic alliances with dissatisfied provincial governors who felt Aram's reforms had favored the capital too heavily. The eastern frontier began to bend, not break, bend, and Aram recognized the pattern. IT was his own strategy reflected back at him. The two leaders were alike in unsettling ways, both outsiders to old dynasties, both masters of narrative, both convinced they were building something that would outlast them. But there was one difference. Aram believed in institutions. Malik believed in momentum. And momentum is harder to predict. The first true battle came at the River Haleth. Aram's disciplined infantry formed tight defensive lines. Malik's cavalry circled like a living storm, striking supply wagons, isolating flanks, refusing direct engagement until exhaustion set in. Days stretched. Neither side claimed decisive victory. But the message was clear. This would not be a short war. Inside Aram's capital, cracks deepened. Merchants complained of collapsing eastern trade. Nobles resented emergency levies. Veterans grumbled that reforms meant to bring fairness had diluted privilege they once enjoyed. Aram stood before the Senate Hall and delivered a speech meant to steady the realm. "We are not fighting for land," he declared. "We are fighting for the idea that many can stand as one." It was a powerful line, but ideas compete, and Malik's idea was simpler. We are one because we always were. In uncertain times, simplicity spreads faster. Then came betrayal. One of Aram's most trusted generals, Commander Darius, defected with 2 full legions. Not for gold, for belief. He claimed Aram had grown cautious, that the fire of revolution had cooled into bureaucracy, that the new empire was beginning to resemble the old one it had replaced. The defection nearly broke the eastern defenses. Malik seized the opportunity. Cities that once resisted now opened their gates. And for the first time since taking the throne, Aram faced something unfamiliar. Not fear, doubt. Years passed in grinding conflict. An single battle ended IT, an dramatic siege. Instead, borders shifted like sand dunes. Some seasons favored Aram, others favored Malik. Famine struck both realms. Plague followed armies. Generations grew up knowing nothing but tension between reform and destiny. And then, unexpectedly, both leaders aged. Aram, older now, walked alone through the royal archives one night. He found a map drawn during the reign of the king he had replaced. He studied it for a long time. The borders were different. The names had changed, but the pattern was familiar. Rise, struggle, stability, challenge, cycle. That he realized then that empires do not defeat each other permanently. They inherit each other. Malik, too, began to slow. He had unified the desert. He had forced recognition from a civilization that once dismissed his people as scattered tribes. He had achieved what many before him had failed to do. But unity built on momentum requires constant motion, and motion exhausts in their final years. Envoys crossed the frontier more often than armies did. Trade resumed in cautious steps. Border towns became share markets rather than battlefields. Neither empire conquered the other. Instead, they settled into coexistence, that a tense balance point to ideologies, facing one another across a river that had run red too many times. History would later call it the era of twin eagles, point two powers, point two visions, locked not in annihilation, but in rivalry. And centuries later, when both had faded into memory, scholars would debate which system had truly been stronger. The answer? Neither, because what endured was not Aram's reforms, not Malik's destiny, but the blending of both. The frontier regions developed hybrid laws. Trade routes mixed cultures. Military tactics merged discipline with mobility. Religion absorbed desert mysticism into imperial tradition. The empires vanished. The fusion remained. And somewhere, far in the future, when a new ruler rose claiming to build something eternal, the old pattern would quietly stir beneath their feet. Because power changes hands, borders redraw, names fade, but the human struggle between order and momentum, that never ends beyond the eastern desert. A new force was emerging, swift, unified, and unexpected. Traders whispered of a leader who demanded respect, not tribute. He was called Malik, the Falcon of the Sands. Born without privilege, he had learned early that loyalty was earned. Unlike Aram, who relied on institutions and diplomacy, Malik relied on belief, speed, and the unyielding momentum of his people. He did not conquer the desert tribes. He united them. Shared laws replaced blood feuds. Councils advised him, but ultimate authority rested with his will. Once the desert was whole, Malik turned outward. The first clashes with Aram's frontier forces were not full-scale battles, but strategic raids, testing supply lines and alliances that Aram's disciplined army held strong, defending river passes and garrisons. But cracks began to appear within his own ranks. Nobles and merchants questioned reforms, and one trusted general, Commander Darius, defected with 2 legions, claiming Aram had grown cautious and bureaucratic. Malik seized the moment, pressing into open cities and weakening Aram's grip. Years of grinding conflict followed. Borders shifted like desert dunes. Some seasons favored Aram's structured approach, others Malik's rapid strikes. Both leaders aged, realizing that outright victory was elusive. Envoys began crossing the frontier more than armies. Trade cautiously resumed, and a tense coexistence settled in. This period, later called the era of twin eagles, was not about annihilation but rivalry, blending Aram's reforms with Malik's momentum. Though their empires would eventually fade, the cultural fusion, hybrid laws, and merged military tactics endured, leaving a legacy far beyond conquest. The human struggle between order and momentum, the push and pull of discipline and ambition, was eternal. The desert was alive, that it did not sleep. It did not forgive. It had long been a place where empires went to test themselves and failed, where armies arrived like tides only to vanish, swallowed by sand and sun. And now, it had a master. Malik, the Falcon of the Sands, moved silently through this vast expanse. Unlike kings who wore gold and commanded cities, Malik wore simple leather armor and rode a horse bred for speed rather than size. His eyes were sharp as a hawk's, and his mind sharper than the curved blades carried by his warriors. He did not inherit power. He forged it from the bones of neglect, the scattered loyalties of desert tribes, and the whispers of merchants who spoke of fair trade and protection. He began quietly. Small raids against hostile tribes that had long preyed upon one another. He offered amnesty to those who joined him, protection to those who submitted, and a vision that transcended old grudges. Unity under a single banner, a sense of purpose stronger than fear. Within months, tribes that had bled each other dry for generations were coordinating patrols, sharing resources, and training together. By the first winter, Malik's influence was undeniable. The desert tribes, once fractured and vulnerable, now operated like a single organism, and the news traveled faster than horses. Traders spoke of checkpoints where caravans once plundered were now protected. Local governors sent reports of organized militias moving through previously lawless territories. Soldiers trained in the art of speed and deception were multiplying. Aram received the first intelligence in the spring. At first, he dismissed it. The desert had always been unruly. Its threats were seasonal, opportunistic. But the raids began escalating. Supply lines that had once run smoothly through the eastern frontier were disrupted. Food wagons were captured, river crossings blocked. Provincial governors, some loyal to Aram but dissatisfied with reform measures, began quietly shifting allegiance, pledging support, or at least neutrality. To Malik, the young falcon was clever. He did not seek direct confrontation with Aram's disciplined army. He understood the limitations of momentum against organization. Instead, he relied on harassment, on psychological warfare. His cavalry struck in waves, then vanished like smoke. His light infantry infiltrated border towns, sowing rumors, creating uncertainty. The message was clear. We are here, we are strong, and patience is a weapon we wield as effectively as swords. Aram, despite his seasoned strategic mind, struggled to respond. Discipline was his greatest weapon, yet it relied on predictability. Malik's unpredictability undermined that. The eastern frontier became a chessboard where every move had unseen consequences. When Aram fortified one pass, Malik shifted his forces miles away to threaten supply depots. When Aram launched counter-raids, Malik had already melted into the desert, leaving behind only whispers of where he had been. Then came the first major confrontation, the River Haleth, a narrow river cutting through rolling desert ridges. Here, Aram gathered his legions, forming disciplined lines of infantry with cavalry held in reserve, archers positioned to cover every approach. It was a textbook deployment, a fortress built on preparation and patience. Malik did not attack head-on. He circled, sending small detachments to disrupt supply wagons and probe weak points. For days, his forces refused to engage fully, testing endurance and morale. Aram's troops marched, countered, held formation. Days passed. Horses tired. Soldiers despaired. Aram realized that Malik's goal was not to destroy but to stretch, exhaust, and coerce the empire into mistakes. And it worked. Inside the capital, tension mounted. Nobles accused Aram of overcaution. Merchants complained about disrupted trade. Veterans demanded aggressive action, recalling the old days of decisive battles and swift conquest. Meanwhile, Malik was not idle. He courted dissent. Commander Darius, once Aram's most trusted general, began secret negotiations with the Falcon, citing the king's bureaucracy and caution as a betrayal of their shared vision. The betrayal was staggering. 2 full legions marched to Malik's side overnight, changing the balance in the east. Towns that had resisted now opened gates without fight. Aram's empire, once confident and consolidated, now wavered. For the first time, he confronted the reality that leadership required more than discipline. It demanded inspiration and adaptability against an enemy who lived by momentum rather than structure. For years, the conflict dragged on. Battles erupted unpredictably. Towns changed hands repeatedly. Trade routes became lifelines for spies and saboteurs. Neither side could claim total victory, yet both endured tremendous losses. Generations grew up knowing the sound of arrows and the clatter of swords more than laughter or peace. And through it all, the desert remained a crucible, shaping leaders, soldiers, and civilians alike into hardened survivors. Aram aged into a ruler who understood the subtle truth of power. Empires are not held by conquest alone, but by loyalty, legitimacy, and the ability to adapt. Malik aged into a commander whose fame relied on vision and momentum, whose people believed in his destiny more than his decrees. Neither could fully conquer the other, but each left an indelible mark on the region. In their twilight years, envoys traveled more than armies. The frontier that had once been a battlefield of constant raids and sieges became a zone of negotiation, trade, and tense coexistence. The era came to be known as the era of Twin Eagles, where two powers, born of different philosophies, shaped a civilization that blended discipline with momentum, law with flexibility, and endurance with ambition. Even after both leaders passed, their legacy endured. Borders, trade, military tactics, and even cultural practices reflected the fusion of Aram's careful reforms with Malik's relentless drive. And centuries later, historians would study this period as an example not of conquest, but of adaptation, patience, and the subtle interplay between order and chaos. Centuries had passed since Aram and Malik had walked the earth. Their names survived in chronicles and whispered legends, tales told by elders around desert fires or in the camellit halls of distant cities. Maps no longer bore the banners of the Twin Eagles. Borders had shifted, rivers changed course, forests expanded where open plains once lay. The empires they had built had endured, adapted, and then begun to fracture. It started subtly, not with armies or invasions, but with decisions made in the quiet chambers of power. Governors, once loyal, began imposing heavier taxes to fund lavish courts. Trade routes that had prospered under the careful blending of Aram's discipline and Malik's mobility faltered when factions argued over tariffs and tolls. Merchants complained, armies grumbled. The machinery of empire, so meticulously maintained for generations, began to rust from within. New powers emerged on the peripheries, small city-states that had once been minor outposts. They were clever and ruthless, led by commanders who had studied the legends of Aram and Malik as tactical manuals. Where the Twin Eagles had relied on coordinated forces and disciplined troops, these new rivals thrived on mobility, deception, and alliances forged through marriage, trade, and intimidation. Slowly, they chipped away at the once unified territories. Internal rebellion flared next. Provinces rich in resources, mines, fertile lands, and coastal ports began asserting autonomy. Governors who had once pledged loyalty demanded recognition of independence. Some armies mutinied, refusing to fight outside their borders. Diplomatic envoys arrived bearing impossible demands, promising alliances in exchange for secession. The central authority, which had survived decades of clever diplomacy and military genius, now found itself stretched impossibly thin. Natural disaster struck at the worst moments. A prolonged drought devastated the northern granaries, followed by flooding that swept away roads connecting major cities. Disease spread through crowded towns, killing thousands and undermining morale. With food scarce and funds depleted, even the most loyal troops began to question whether the legacy of the Twin Eagles was worth defending. Amid this chaos, a new figure arose in the north, Selena, the daughter of the Dunes. Like Malik centuries before, she understood momentum and belief better than brute force. She united wandering nomads and displaced soldiers into a disciplined yet agile army. Unlike the slow, bureaucratic methods of the old empires, she moved swiftly, striking at weakened garrisons and gaining support among the population with promises of justice and fair treatment. The final conflicts were not like the great battles of Aram or Malik. They were grinding wars of attrition, sieges that lasted months, skirmishes that bled both sides without producing glory. The old fortress cities fell one by one, either through surrender or silent defection. Where discipline once held the empire together, now hesitation and fear spread like wildfire. The armies of the Twin Eagles heirs still fought valiantly, but they fought on fractured fronts, with commanders divided in loyalty and vision. By the time the capital city itself faced the inevitable, it was more a shadow of its former self. Towers that had withstood centuries of storms now bore the marks of neglect. The great walls, once meticulously maintained, had crumbled in sections. The streets were clogged with refugees, merchants, and displaced soldiers. The Central Council, once a symbol of order, argued endlessly while the enemy advanced. And then, one cold dawn, Selena arrived at the gates. She did not break them down with catapults or battering rams. She simply held her army in formation, banners raised, discipline unbroken. Her reputation preceded her. The defenders, exhausted and demoralized, recognized that the age of the Twin Eagles had ended. The gates opened, not with fire or blood, but with resignation. The city changed hands without a single arrow loosed. Yet even in collapse, the legacies of Aram and Malik persisted. The new rulers learned from their methods. Aram's emphasis on disciplined governance, Malik's use of momentum and inspiration. Selena did not destroy the cities, she adapted them. She did not annihilate the old armies. She integrated surviving officers into her ranks. Civilization endured but transformed. The chronicles of the time would call it the twilight of the Twin Eagles, a period where even the greatest empires fall, not through a single cataclysmic battle, but through generations of erosion, ambition, and change. And yet, like the desert winds, the ideas of unity, discipline, and momentum never truly die. They shift, evolve, and reappear in new forms. For centuries to come, the story of Aram, Malik, and their descendants would be told as a lesson. No matter how strong, no matter how visionary, empires are temporary. What survives is not their borders, not their armies, but the principles they instilled and the next generation of leaders waiting in the wings. Centuries had softened the scars of the Twin Eagles' dominion, but the echoes of their empire never faded. Cities once abandoned had been rebuilt, riverbanks irrigated, roads restored. And in these lands, far from the deserts and rivers where Aram and Malik had ruled, new powers began to stir. The descendants of old dynasties had splintered into minor principalities, often at odds with one another. Yet the memory of unity lingered in the tales of elders, in the maps preserved in monastic archives, in the coins that bore the faces of long-dead rulers. And where memory lingers, ambition awakens that a new figure emerged from the northern highlands, a man named Kaelen. He was not born to wealth, nor to noble blood, but he had inherited the restless spirit of the desert, the tactical cunning of generals long gone. Kaelen studied every battle, every campaign, every failure of the Twin Eagle successors. He understood that empires could rise again, not through raw force alone, but through cunning, patience, and the careful manipulation of human ambition. His rise began quietly. He forged alliances with trade guilds, promising protection and favorable tariffs. He courted minor nobles with gifts and promises of power. He strengthened border defenses, but he did not boast, he did not strike openly. He moved like a shadow, observing the weaknesses of his rivals while presenting only an image of prudence. In the first year of his campaign, Kaelen's spies intercepted secret correspondence between two powerful city-states. They plotted against one another, unaware that Kaelen had access to both sides. With subtle hints and carefully leaked information, he ensured their rivalry escalated, draining resources, exhausting armies, and eroding trust. By the time either city realized the manipulation, Kaelen had already positioned his forces strategically, not to conquer, but to absorb. He preferred integration over destruction, discipline over chaos, a lesson inherited from Aram's old teachings. Yet Kaelen also understood the value of momentum. Where Aram relied on slow, methodical patience, Kaelen combined it with rapid, decisive strikes at critical moments. When one of the rival city-states finally moved its army against him, he feigned retreat. Small skirmishes drew their forces into narrow valleys and treacherous passes. And when they were fully committed, his cavalry struck with precision and devastating force. In the course of a single dawn, a force of 10,000 routed 20,000. Casualties were heavy, but Kaelen's discipline and timing ensured his army remained intact and capable of further campaigns. As word of his victory spread, a new wave of loyalty surged. Merchants and soldiers alike joined his cause, drawn by the promise of stability, opportunity, and wealth. Former rivals found themselves working for him, sometimes reluctantly, sometimes with the fervor of converts. Kaelen had learned from history that loyalty was not given. It was inspired through vision, opportunity, and fear carefully balanced with respect. But Kaelen's greatest challenge came not from armies or borders, but from intrigue within his own court. Ministers plotted in whispers. Advisors offered conflicting counsel, each seeking to influence the young ruler's decisions. Spies infiltrated his council chambers, some pretending loyalty, others driven by desperation or greed. The young empire teetered between unity and collapse, and Kaelen learned quickly that true power lay as much in understanding human nature as in battlefield strategy. He began a series of calculated purges, not of entire families, not indiscriminately, but of those whose ambitions threatened the cohesion of the realm. His decisions were deliberate, precise, surgical, earning him both fear and respect. Soldiers who once questioned their loyalty now followed him with devotion, recognizing that he possessed the same iron will that had allowed Aram to endure 7 days of arrow storms and Malak to unify scattered tribes. Meanwhile, distant empires watched warily. Kingdoms to the east and west began forming alliances, hoping to check Kaelen before his influence grew too great. But his diplomacy was subtle. Where open war would have been costly, he used trade agreements, marriage pacts, and the threat of strategic raids to assert control without bloodshed. And when battle became unavoidable, Kaelen's army, trained in the fusion of discipline and rapid maneuver, proved nearly unstoppable. Over the course of a decade, Kaelen expanded his dominion. Former cities of the Twin Eagles became central hubs in his empire, their walls repaired, their markets thriving. His armies, though formidable, were lean, mobile, and loyal. Every officer, every soldier knew the history of Aram and Malak, and they internalized the lessons. Patience could be weaponized, momentum could be directed, and the right strike at the right moment could decide the fate of thousands. Yet even in this era of brilliance, danger loomed. Rival generals trained their eyes on the young emperor, seeking a moment to turn his successes against him. Harsh winters, famine, and disease reminded all that human plans were fragile. And the longer Kaelen ruled, the more ambitious his enemies became, plotting alliances and betrayals that would rival any scene in history. From the shadows, whispers began to circulate of a hidden power moving beyond the mountains. Nomadic clans, unbound by the rules of empire, led by a mysterious figure who was said to move faster than any army, strike harder than any siege engine, and vanish without a trace. The Falcon of the Sand's legacy, it seemed, had not died. It had returned, waiting for a new moment to challenge the Emperor of the Twin Eagles' successors. The stage was set. Kaelen, the young ruler who had fused the lessons of centuries into a single, unstoppable force, now faced a challenge that would test his patience, his discipline, and his ability to see the battlefield not as it appeared, but as it could become. And in the coming years, his empire, and the fate of all those who depended upon it, would hang on decisions made in the shadows, whispers in the night, and strikes at the perfect moment. From the frozen ridges of the northern highlands, a whisper became a roar. Villagers spoke of riders who moved like wraiths over snow and stone, striking in the night, vanishing before dawn. Caravans that had once passed safely were found overturned, their horses missing, their guards vanished. And above all, the leader remained unseen, a figure only glimpsed from afar, the Shadow Hawk. Unlike any enemy Kaelen had faced, the Shadow Hawk did not rely on massed armies. His strength lay in secrecy, speed, and unpredictability. Clan warriors were trained from birth in ambushes, in traps, in using terrain to their advantage. Their arrows could pierce armor at impossible ranges. Their blades were curved for maximum lethality, and their horses were bred to survive even the harshest winters. Every encounter left survivors in terror, carrying stories that spread like wildfire. Kaelen, informed by scouts and spies, understood immediately that brute force alone would fail. Sending his legions into the mountains without preparation would be suicide. Instead, he relied on intelligence, fortifications, and deception. Cities along the northern passes were reinforced, supply lines doubled, and alliances were sought with clans willing to turn against the Shadow Hawk for favors or protection. For months, the Shadow Hawk avoided direct confrontation. He struck quickly, taking only what he needed, leaving false trails and dead horses to confuse pursuers. Kaelen's commanders grew restless. Troops trained for traditional warfare, for discipline and formation, were frustrated by this invisible enemy. The young emperor realized that this was a battle of patience and perception, echoing the lessons of Aram and Malik centuries before. Then came the first massive confrontation. One frigid dawn, the Shadowhawks' forces were spotted massing in the canyon of Drenwald, a narrow gorge flanked by cliffs. Kaelen's scouts reported that the northern clans were preparing an ambush. Kaelen did not panic. He remembered the long history of leaders like Malik, who had turned attrition and psychological pressure into weapons. He ordered his army to advance slowly, shields overlapping, archers at the ready, infantry bracing against possible collapse of the cliffs, cavalry positioned to exploit any breakthrough. The first attack came as expected. Arrows rained down from above, hundreds piercing armor, cutting horses, and sowing chaos. Yet Kaelen's formation held. Infantry shields formed walls, archers returned fire, and elite cavalry units awaited the perfect moment to counterstrike. The Shadowhawks' forces expected panic, confusion, and a broken line. But Kaelen had trained his soldiers in endurance. His men were calm, disciplined, and deadly precise. Days of skirmishing followed. The northern clans harassed supply lines, raided isolated outposts, and melted into the snow before reinforcements could arrive. Kaelen responded by dividing his forces, some defending critical points, some conducting counter-raids, and some probing the enemy for weaknesses. Each movement required exact timing, every decision measured in risk and reward. Casualties mounted, morale fluctuated, but Kaelen's disciplined leadership prevented collapse. Finally, a turning point emerged. Scouts discovered that the Shadowhawks' army relied heavily on a network of hidden passes, caves, and supply caches within the mountains. Kaelen devised a plan that combined patient observation with sudden, overwhelming force. A small detachment would lure the northern clans into a trap along the frozen riverbeds, while the main army waited, hidden in valleys above. The ambush was precise. Kaelen timed every movement like a master conductor orchestrating a symphony of war. When the northern clan charged, they encountered a wall of steel, shield and spear bristling outward, crossbow bolts raining down with lethal precision. Cavalry struck from above, cutting off retreat. The Shadowhawks' forces fought with unmatched skill, but the disciplined execution of Kaelen's army turned the tide. Within hours, the clans were broken, retreating into the forests they knew so well. Casualties were significant on both sides, but Kaelen had demonstrated a critical point. Patience, intelligence, and timing could neutralize even the deadliest guerrilla tactics. Yet Kaelen knew this was only the beginning. The Shadowhawk had survived, his reputation enhanced by the clash. The northern clans would regroup, recruit, and return with new strategies. Kaelen's victory was tactical, not strategic. The real challenge lay ahead, to not just defeat the Shadowhawk in battle, but to dismantle the fear, loyalty, and mythology that made him a legend among his people. As the snow melted and spring approached, Kaelen began consolidating his gains. Fortifications were strengthened, supply lines improved, and alliances deepened. Scouts were sent farther north than ever before, mapping hidden trails and cave networks. And all the while, the Shadow Hawk watched, waiting for the moment when the disciplined emperor might falter, knowing that even the greatest armies are only as strong as the human will that drives them. The stage was set for an epic struggle that would span years, testing not only the tactical brilliance of Kaelen, but the resilience, courage, and ingenuity of every soldier, scout, and citizen within his empire. History, once again, was being written, not in hours, but in decades, in patience and preparation, and in the relentless clash of ambition against cunning. Spring arrived with a promise of renewal, yet the northern highlands remained a land of danger, shadows, and whispered threats. The Shadow Hawk had vanished after the previous clash, but his influence lingered. Villages in the northern valleys swore by his name. Their loyalty was unwavering, their hatred for outsiders refined like steel. Kaelen knew that to secure lasting peace, he could not merely win battles. He had to break the very myth of the Shadow Hawk, the idea that a single, unseen leader could control fate itself. Kaelen began a meticulous campaign. He divided his forces into specialized units, each with a precise role. Infantry were trained to hold lines on treacherous passes, crossbowmen to strike unseen targets from ridges, and cavalry to exploit any opening with blinding speed. Supply lines were carefully fortified with mobile depots, ensuring that even in harsh terrain, his army would remain fed and equipped. Scouts and spies moved constantly, mapping the labyrinthine forests, cliffs, and valleys, reporting on enemy movements and the locations of hidden caches. The first major siege of the campaign came at the fortress of Haldren, perched atop a jagged cliff overlooking the Silver River. The northern clans had fortified it using every natural advantage: hidden stone paths, high walls, and traps for the unwary. Yet Kaelen approached, as he always did, with patience, observation, and a readiness to exploit any weakness. For weeks, he encircled the fortress, cutting off supply routes and observing the defenders' routines. Archers peppered the walls, but Kaelen forbade reckless assaults. His army endured hunger, cold nights, and constant skirmishes, but the discipline drilled into them over years held firm. Inside the fortress, the Shadow Hawk watched silently. He understood the methods of Kaelen, having studied the same histories, the same patterns of patience and discipline that had guided the Twin Eagles centuries ago. He sent out raiders in small, precise attacks, hoping to lure Kaelen's men into ambushes. Yet Kaelen anticipated every move, learning from each encounter, turning harassment into intelligence. Every fallen raider, every intercepted message, became another puzzle piece in the grand design. Then came the decisive maneuver. Kaelen dispatched a contingent to feign a frontal assault while secretly moving his main force through a concealed mountain pass. For days, the defenders of Haldren believed the attack came from one direction, until Kaelen's troops emerged where the Shadow Hawk least expected, cutting off retreat and trapping the defenders. The battle was brutal. Snow, rock, and steel mingled as the disciplined lines of Kaelen's infantry pressed against the guerrilla-hardened warriors of the north. Arrows streaked across the sky, swords clashed, and horses screamed. Yet despite the ferocity, Kaelen's forces maintained cohesion, turning each moment of chaos into a calculated advantage. By nightfall, the fortress was taken. The Shadow Hawk himself was not present, having slipped through the mountains with his remaining loyalists. Kaelen, however, had achieved something far more significant than victory in battle. He had shown that even the seemingly untouchable leader could be outmaneuvered. The psychological blow to the northern clans was immense. Fear began to spread, yet admiration lingered. They respected the emperor who could match them step for step, strategy for strategy. Kaelen did not rest. He used the momentum to consolidate northern valleys, rebuilding infrastructure, fortifying roads, and integrating local leaders into his administration. But he knew the Shadow Hawk was watching, waiting for a moment of overconfidence. Letters intercepted from his spies revealed plans for a counterattack. one that would unite several clans for a coordinated strike against Kaelen's newly secured territories. It was an ambitious plan, one that could unravel everything the Emperor had built. Months of preparation followed. Kaelen trained his troops for the coming winter campaign, emphasizing endurance, improvisation, and the coordination of combined arms. Cavalry units practiced charges over frozen rivers, archers trained in precision under blinding snowstorms, and engineers reinforced bridges and fortifications. Every day, Kaelen studied the intelligence reports, crafting strategies to counter ambushes, feints, and psychological ploys. He knew that a single misstep could cost thousands of lives, and perhaps the entire northern frontier. When the Shadow Hawk struck, it was as predicted, a series of sudden, simultaneous raids across multiple passes and villages. The northern clans sought to divide Kaelen's forces, striking isolated outposts to provoke panic. Yet the Emperor had anticipated their tactics. His scouts communicated rapidly using flags and signals. Reserves were positioned to reinforce threatened areas almost instantly. The northern warriors found themselves facing disciplined units instead of scattered defenders. Every ambush was countered, every trap neutralized. The climax of this campaign came in the Frosted Pass, a narrow gorge bordered by sheer cliffs on both sides. Here, the Shadow Hawk concentrated his forces, intending to crush one of Kaelen's columns and break the northern frontier. Kaelen, aware of the strategic importance, prepared his army meticulously. Infantry formed tight phalanxes. Archers took positions on higher ground, and cavalry waited for the perfect moment to exploit gaps. The pass became a deadly chessboard, each side anticipating the other's moves with near precognitive precision. The battle lasted 3 days. Arrows darkened the sky, snow turned to blood-soaked ice, and the deafening clash of steel echoed between cliffs. The Shadow Hawk fought with unparalleled skill, directing troops personally, exploiting terrain, and using ambushes with terrifying efficiency. Yet Kaelen's patience, discipline, and coordination ultimately prevailed. On the third day, his cavalry executed a perfect flank, striking the Shadow Hawk's rear and breaking the northern forces. Survivors fled into the forests, their morale shattered. The Shadow Hawk himself disappeared once more into legend, leaving Kaelen as the uncontested master of the Northern Highlands. But the Emperor did not celebrate. He knew that true victory was never final, that myths were more resilient than armies, and that patience and discipline were eternal weapons, if wielded correctly. His empire had grown stronger, but the northern threat had taught him that leadership required not just strategy, but constant vigilance, intelligence, and the ability to inspire loyalty without crushing hope. Kaelen's story was becoming legend, a new chapter in the continuum of history that began with Aram and Malik. The principles endured: discipline, patience, and momentum. Yet a shadow always lurked, reminding the world that for every empire that rises, unseen forces wait, testing the limits of leadership, endurance, and vision. Years had passed since the Battle of the Frosted Pass, yet Kaelen's empire was far from secure. The Northern Highlands had been tamed through a combination of diplomacy, strategic victories, and the subtle reshaping of local loyalties. Yet, true consolidation required more than victories on the battlefield. It demanded mastery over politics, human ambition, and the invisible games played in dimly lit council chambers. Kaelen's court had grown in size and complexity. Advisors, generals, merchants, and foreign dignitaries filled the halls of his mountain fortress. Some were loyal, shaped by years of shared hardship and triumph. But others were opportunists, waiting for a single misstep to advance their own fortunes. Kaelen had learned from history that the greatest threats often came from within. The men and women who whispered in shadowed corridors could be as dangerous as armies of the Shadow Hawk. The first major test of internal stability came in the form of Lord Riven, a former ally turned ambitious rival. Riven had commanded one of Kaelen's northern garrisons and was respected by his troops, but his hunger for power eclipsed loyalty. He conspired to sow dissent, promising certain northern clans greater autonomy if they betrayed Kaelen's authority. Kaelen, aware of the whispers, did not act rashly. He had studied the failures of Aram, Malik, and even the emperors of the Twin Eagles. Punitive action without evidence often bred rebellion instead of preventing it. Instead, Kaelen employed a different strategy. He invited Lord Riven to the capital under the guise of a grand council, offering honors and the chance to demonstrate his loyalty. During the council, Kaelen subtly revealed intercepted letters, reports of secret alliances, and inconsistencies in Riven's story. It was not a public accusation, but a carefully orchestrated exposure. Riven realized the extent of Kaelen's intelligence network and the futility of rebellion. By the council's end, he was forced to swear renewed fealty, his ambition checked without bloodshed, a testament to the Emperor's understanding that patience and timing could neutralize even the most dangerous internal threats. Meanwhile, the Shadow Hawk remained a looming threat from the north. Rumors suggested he had united several clans, trained a new generation of elite warriors, and learned from the mistakes of the past. Kaelen, recognizing the threat, prepared his army meticulously, balancing fortifications with mobility, intelligence gathering with diplomacy. He dispatched spies, mapped hidden passes, and began training elite units in the art of winter warfare, anticipating that the northern leader would strike during the harshest season, where discipline and preparation would be decisive. The first skirmishes of this campaign were subtle but brutal. The Shadow Hawks raiders attacked supply lines, isolated garrisons, and villages loyal to Kaelen. Their attacks were lightning fast, almost invisible, leaving minimal traces. Kaelen's forces responded with careful counter-ambushes. Every encounter was a test of endurance, patience, and adaptability. Soldiers learned to fight in freezing temperatures, on treacherous cliffs, and under snow-laden skies. Discipline was drilled into every unit. Retreat only when ordered, strike only when advantage is certain. Hold formation even under psychological duress. Be why the third winter of this decade-long campaign, Kaelen had gathered intelligence indicating that the Shadow Hawk intended to strike the mountain fortress of Aldrin, a key stronghold controlling access to the northern valleys. The fortress was defended by experienced troops, but the Shadow Hawk's cunning and the harsh terrain posed a mortal threat. Kaelen devised a plan of exquisite complexity. He allowed misinformation to leak, suggesting that the fortress was lightly defended and supplies were scarce. In reality, reinforcements were hidden in deep ravines. Reserve cavalry waited behind frozen ridges, and elite archers positioned themselves on cliffs with an unobstructed line of fire. The Shadow Hawk took the bait. Under a crescent moon, his forces advanced. Thousands of warriors moved silently through snow-dusted forests, confident in the element of surprise. But as they reached the fortress's outer perimeter, they found themselves trapped between prepared lines, cut off from retreat, and subjected to devastating crossfire from archers above. Kaelen's cavalry struck from hidden valleys, flanking the attackers with overwhelming speed. Chaos erupted. For hours, snow, steel, and fire intertwined in a battle of epic proportions. Even the Shadow Hawk himself fought with unmatched skill, directing his elite warriors, adapting strategies in real time, exploiting terrain and weather. Yet Kaelen had anticipated such moves. Every feint, every ambush, every attempt to retreat or regroup was countered by the Emperor's disciplined formations and rapid communication networks. The northern clans suffered heavy casualties, and the legend of the Shadow Hawk's invincibility began to waver. After 3 days of continuous combat, the Shadow Hawk ordered a retreat. His forces, though still formidable, were fractured and demoralized. Kaelen's army, disciplined and resilient, held their positions, ensuring the enemy could not regroup easily. This victory was decisive not merely for its tactical brilliance, but for the psychological impact. The Shadow Hawk, once untouchable in myth, had been bested through strategy, preparation, and unyielding patience. Kaelen did not pursue recklessly. He knew the dangers of overextension, the fragility of human endurance, and the importance of consolidating gains before the next challenge. Supplies were secured, The wounded were treated, fortifications reinforced, and intelligence networks expanded. Kaelen understood that leadership was measured not just by battlefield victories, but by sustaining an empire through cycles of war, winter, famine, and intrigue. Yet the story of Kaelen's empire was far from complete. Even as he strengthened the north, whispers emerged from the east. A coalition of rival lords, seeing the success of Kaelen, were beginning to plot against him. Ambitions, jealousies, and ancient rivalries threatened to ignite a wider conflict. And across the empire, ordinary citizens watched and wondered, caught between fear and awe, as the emperor whose patience had turned arrows into strategy now prepared for campaigns that could span decades. Kaelen, like the great commanders of history, understood one immutable truth. An empire is only as strong as its patience, its discipline, and its vision. One miscalculation, one moment of overconfidence could undo everything. And in the shadows, the Shadow Hawk waited, preparing for a return that would test Kaelen's genius like never before. Winter had passed, leaving only a frozen memory of the previous campaign, and yet the northern highlands stirred once more. The Shadow Hawk had vanished, but not in defeat. In hidden valleys, snow-laden forests, and secluded mountain fortresses, he rebuilt, trained new warriors, and forged alliances that crossed old clan rivalries. His name, whispered like a storm across the northern reaches, had taken on a mythic weight. Wherever travelers dared to tread, they spoke of his coming vengeance, and the loyalty of the clans strengthened under his careful hand. Kaelen, ever vigilant, did not underestimate this resurgence. Reports from scouts and informants painted a clear picture. The Shadow Hawk had learned from past encounters. His new forces were larger, better trained, and equipped with intelligence networks designed to anticipate Kaelen's movements. His raiding parties were faster, his tactics more unpredictable, and his leadership, once unseen, had become almost legendary. The Emperor understood that this was not a skirmish. This was a campaign that could decide the fate of the northern territories for decades. Preparation became an obsession. Kaelen inspected fortifications, ensuring that every outpost, bridge, and mountain pass was secured. Supply lines were reinforced with mobile caches, hidden in ravines and caves. Infantry were drilled for months in the discipline of endurance. Cavalry trained for rapid flanking maneuvers, and archers perfected their precision in harsh weather conditions. Kaelen himself rode alongside scouts, testing their knowledge of the terrain, watching for gaps, and predicting how the Shadow Hawk might exploit them. The first wave of the Shadow Hawk's attack came subtly but decisively. Raiders struck isolated villages and outposts, seizing resources and retreating before Kaelen's forces could arrive. The Emperor had anticipated such harassment, and counter-raids were dispatched to recover lost supplies, harass retreating forces, and gather intelligence. Each engagement was brief, brutal, and calculated, testing the enemy's willingness to risk exposure. Kaelen understood that the northern leader thrived on psychological warfare, fear, uncertainty, and the myth of invincibility, and he would need to dismantle that legend piece by piece. Then, in the deep heart of spring, the Shadow Hawk launched his first full-scale assault. An army of 10,000 warriors descended on the fortress of Valdrin, the northern stronghold that had once withstood his previous raids. They advanced through the hidden mountain passes, moving silently under the cover of dense forests. The assault was perfectly timed, designed to strike before Kaelen's reinforcements could mobilize, and with the expectation that fatigue and surprise would cripple the defenders. Kaelen had foreseen this. His troops were ready, disciplined, and strategically positioned. Archers rained a storm of arrows from elevated positions, their lines overlapping to prevent any gaps. Infantry braced in tight formations along choke points, shields locked and spears angled outward to pierce any force that tried to break through. Cavalry was held in reserve, hidden behind ridges and forest cover, waiting for the perfect moment to exploit the northern army's weaknesses. The battle lasted 3 days, each moment an intricate dance of anticipation, endurance, and precision. The Shadow Hawk's forces struck repeatedly, attempting to flank, outmaneuver, and disorient Kaelen's men. Yet the disciplined formations held. Even when the enemy pressed hard, the Emperor's signals orchestrated movements with the exactness of a symphony. Soldiers endured exhaustion, cold, hunger, and relentless harassment, yet did not break. Every day tested their physical limits and their capacity for patience. Finally, the decisive moment arrived. The Shadow Hawk, confident in his numbers and the precision of his assault, attempted to strike the fortress from multiple fronts simultaneously. Kaelen's reserves, hidden and ready, struck the enemy's flanks and rear with perfect timing. Cavalry surged forward, slicing through the northern lines, while archers unleashed a volley of arrows that decimated enemy ranks. The psychological impact was devastating. The mythic Shadow Hawk's forces, once feared for their invincibility, were now under relentless, disciplined assault. To be why the end of the campaign, the northern forces were shattered. The Shadow Hawk himself disappeared once more, retreating into hidden strongholds. Yet the Emperor did not pursue recklessly. He understood that patience had been the key to victory, and that overextending could turn triumph into disaster. His army consolidated, wounded soldiers were cared for, and fortifications reinforced to prevent any resurgence. This victory, though decisive, had revealed a truth Kaelen could not ignore. The northern territories were volatile, and the Shadow Hawk remained a symbol of resilience, cunning, and terror. The war was far from over, and as Kaelen looked across the snow-dusted plains, he knew that the real challenge lay not just in defeating enemies in battle, but in dismantling the legends that inspired them, controlling the complex web of loyalty, fear, and myth that stretched across mountains, valleys, and generations. The months that followed the northern campaign were not marked by celebrations, but by whispers in shadowed corridors and subtle games of power. The northern clans, though beaten in battle, had not surrendered their ambitions. The Shadow Hawk remained a ghostly presence, his influence spreading quietly among rival lords, and Kaelen knew that brute force alone would not secure his empire. True mastery lay in understanding the delicate balance of loyalty, fear, and ambition. That Kaelen's spies moved like shadows across the mountains, forests, and valleys. Couriers carried coded messages, travelers whispered secrets, and merchants reported movements of armed bands. He watched every decision made by the rival lords, cataloging ambitions, grudges, and alliances. Some lords believed they could manipulate the Emperor, others simply sought to profit from the chaos. Kaelen allowed them to believe they held power, while subtly steering their actions to serve his greater strategy. The first test came from Lord Varric, a cunning noble in the southern highlands who had long resented Kaelen's growing influence. Varric attempted to forge a secret alliance with remnants of the Shadow Hawk's forces, promising them safe passage and supplies if they helped him seize strategic fortresses. Kaelen intercepted the correspondence before a single word could be delivered. Yet he did not expose the conspiracy outright. He waited, watching, allowing the plot to develop, gauging loyalty, testing the subtle nuances of human ambition. Meanwhile, the Shadow Hawk was not idle. He moved through the northern wilderness, personally training a new generation of warriors and reaching out to exiled clans. His tactics had evolved. Raiding parties no longer struck haphazardly, but with coordinated precision, seeking not only to harm Kaelen's forces, but to fracture alliances and destabilize morale. Kaelen, anticipating this, planted misinformation, creating phantom weaknesses, decoy convoys, and false intelligence. Each deception was carefully crafted to draw the enemy into predictable behavior, turning their cunning against them. The first major test of this intelligence war came in the Frosted Vale, a region notorious for its narrow passes and dense forests. Reports indicated a combined force of northern clans and southern rebels moving to strike a lightly defended fort. Kaelen dispatched a small force to occupy the supposed weak point, while secretly positioning his elite units along hidden ridges and behind frozen streams. As the enemy approached, confident in their advantage, Kaelen's forces sprang their trap. Arrows rained from unseen heights. Cavalry charged through the flanks, and infantry held the narrow passes like walls of iron. Chaos erupted, but Kaelen's troops, disciplined and coordinated, executed every maneuver flawlessly. The Shadow Hawk, learning of the engagement, attempted to intervene, leading a contingent of elite warriors through a concealed valley. Yet Kaelen had anticipated such a move. Cavalry lay in ambush along ridge lines, archers concealed among snow-draped trees, and infantry braced along choke points. When the Shadow Hawk emerged, he found himself ensnared, forced to retreat under heavy fire, his warriors suffering significant losses. The psychological blow was profound. The mythic leader who had once struck fear into the hearts of every northern clan had been countered, manipulated, and outmaneuvered. But Kaelen's genius was not merely in battlefield victories. It was in turning human ambition against itself. Within weeks, intercepted letters revealed renewed plotting among rival lords who feared Kaelen's growing influence. Once again, he allowed their schemes to progress, feeding misinformation that led them to act rashly. Lords who had believed themselves clever were caught in traps, humiliated but spared, their loyalty restored through calculated leniency. Kaelen knew that respect and fear, carefully balanced, were more powerful than bloodshed alone. By the end of the year, Kaelen had not only defended his territories, but had expanded influence over key trade routes, mountain passes, and strategic valleys. The Shadow Hawk remained a threat, yet one that was gradually diminished as Kaelen's intelligence network, discipline, and patience turned the myths of invincibility into tangible vulnerabilities. Every failed ambush, every intercepted communication, and every misstep by rival lords strengthened Kaelen's position, proving that true power was as much in the mind as in the sword. Yet, even in triumph, Kaelen knew the final confrontation with the Shadow Hawk was inevitable. The northern leader's cunning, patience, and resilience meant that only the most extraordinary strategy could finally end the decades-long conflict. Kaelen began preparations not just for a battle, but for a campaign that would test endurance, patience, discipline, and genius to their limits. Every army, every fortification, every loyal subject would be part of a delicate, interwoven plan designed to finally confront the Shadow Hawk in a decisive, legend-defining encounter. The stage was set. The clans whispered, the forests concealed movement, and the mountains held secrets that only the patient and observant could exploit. Kaelen, standing on a cliff overlooking the northern valleys, understood that history, like the frozen rivers below, moved slowly but inexorably. And when the final confrontation came, it would not merely be a battle. It would be the culmination of decades of patience, intelligence, and strategic mastery, a story that would echo through generations. Years of strategy, patience, and small victories had brought Kaelen's empire to a precarious balance. Every northern valley, mountain pass, and forested ridge had been mapped, fortified, and watched. His spies moved unseen among the clans. His messengers carried coded warnings, and every river, ravine, and highland road was accounted for. And yet, the Shadow Hawk, cunning and patient as the Emperor himself, was still alive, biding his time, preparing for the confrontation that would either restore his legend or end it forever. Intelligence reports had begun arriving with chilling regularity. Small raiding parties struck distant villages, coordinated attacks on supply lines tested Kaelen's patience, and rumors suggested the Shadow Hawk had gathered a coalition of northern clans, outlanders, and even mercenaries from across the Empire's borders. The Emperor understood immediately this would not be a skirmish. This would be a war on a scale that would test every ounce of discipline, endurance, and strategy he had cultivated over decades. Kaelen's preparations were extraordinary. The northern fortresses were reinforced, roads cleared and mined for obstacles, hidden caches of food and weapons positioned along likely routes of advance. Every soldier was trained to operate not only in winter and snow, but in ambush scenarios, counterflanking maneuvers, and psychological manipulation of the enemy. Cavalry units were drilled to move silently through forests, to strike in wedges, and to hold formations even under extreme fatigue. Archers practiced firing volleys with perfect coordination, while infantry learned to maintain shield walls under relentless harassment. At the same time, Kaelen worked to undermine the cohesion of the Shadowhawks coalition. Intercepted letters, disguised messengers, and whispered rumors created distrust among the northern clans. Allies who might have fought together were subtly turned against one another, their confidence shaken, their loyalty uncertain. Kaelen knew that the greatest victories were won not only on the battlefield, but in the hearts and minds of those who would stand or falter before him. Finally, the Shadowhawk appeared. An army numbering tens of thousands emerged from hidden mountain passes and thick forests, converging on Kaelen's territories. The sheer scale of the force was staggering. Mounted warriors skilled in guerrilla tactics, infantry trained to endure harsh conditions, and scouts that moved like shadows through snow and mist. The northern leader intended not merely to fight, but to inspire fear, to prove that Kaelen, for all his patience and discipline, could still be overpowered by cunning and sheer numbers. Kaelen did not panic. He observed, he waited, and he prepared. The Emperor understood that the enemy's greatest strength, mobility, aggression, and unpredictability, could also be its greatest weakness. He arranged his forces along natural choke points, high ridges, and narrow valleys. Hidden cavalry waited in ravines. Archers positioned on cliffs overlooked likely enemy paths, and infantry braced along frozen rivers where the enemy's momentum could be neutralized. It was a tactical chessboard on a scale that stretched for miles. The Shadowhawk struck first, testing Kaelen's lines with lightning raids and probing attacks. His cavalry moved with terrifying speed, attempting to lure the Emperor into mistakes, but every feint was countered with precision. Kaelen's troops held formation, countered attacks, and allowed the enemy to overextend. Day after day, the raiders struck, harassed, and withdrew, all while Kaelen gathered intelligence and readied his decisive strike. Then came the decisive maneuver. Kaelen allowed a central valley to appear vulnerable, baiting the Shadowhawk into committing his full force. Scouts confirmed the enemy's deployment. The northern leader, confident in his advantage, had massed the majority of his warriors in a single valley, leaving flanks exposed. Kaelen waited until the enemy had fully overcommit. He gave the signal. Hidden cavalry thundered from the ridges on either side. Archers unleashed devastating volleys from elevated positions, and disciplined infantry advanced to seal the valley, cutting off retreat. The enemy, trapped, faced a relentless combination of shock cavalry, crossfire, and psychological pressure. The battle was cataclysmic. Arrows darkened the sky. Horses screamed and charged in perfect wedges, and infantry held every inch of ground against desperate attacks. The Shadowhawks' forces, though skilled and numerous, struggled against the coordination, discipline, and patience that Kaelen had honed over decades. Every attempt to break the lines was countered with precision. Every retreat turned into a trap. By the end of the second day, the Northern Coalition was in full retreat. The Shadowhawk, refusing to surrender, attempted a final charge with his elite guard, but Kaelen had anticipated it. Hidden cavalry struck their flanks. Archers focused devastating volleys, and the enemy line collapsed under the weight of discipline and strategy. The northern leader escaped, but his forces were shattered, morale destroyed, and his reputation irreparably tarnished. Kaelen did not celebrate recklessly. He secured the battlefield, treated the wounded, and reorganized his forces. He understood the cost of overextension, the fragility of victory, and the importance of consolidation. Yet, as he surveyed the plain strewn with the remnants of the Northern Army, he recognized the truth of power. True mastery was patience, strategy, and the ability to transform suffering, danger, and uncertainty into opportunity. The legend of Kaelen and the Shadowhawk would be told for generations. Battles were fought not only with steel, but with intelligence, foresight, and the unbreakable will to endure. And while the northern lands were now firmly under Kaelen's control, he knew that true challenges were never permanent. Enemies would rise, alliances would falter, and the delicate balance of power would always demand vigilance, cunning, and the genius that had allowed him to survive, thrive, and command the respect of an empire. The northern winter had faded, leaving behind a thawed but scarred land. For months, the Shadow Hawk had been silent, disappearing into forests, mountains, and hidden valleys, nursing wounds, rebuilding a few scattered remnants of his army, and plotting a final strike that he hoped would restore his shattered legend. He understood that if he failed, Kaelen's empire would consolidate its control, and his name, once feared and respected, would be remembered only as a ghost of defiance that had been broken. Kaelen, aware that the northern leader was still alive, did not relax. His scouts reported movements in remote highlands, hints of gatherings in hidden valleys, and cryptic messages intercepted among the clans. Every report was treated with patience, every detail scrutinized. Kaelen knew the Shadow Hawk signature: ambushes, feints, and attacks designed to provoke rash actions. And he understood that the final confrontation was coming, a battle not just of strength, but of endurance, intelligence, and mental fortitude. Then, one early morning, the Shadow Hawk appeared with an army of 30,000 men, larger than any he had commanded before. He struck like a storm, moving swiftly through mountain passes and taking positions that seemed impossible to reach. Villages were razed, supply lines disrupted, and the population of the northern territories once again trembled at his name. The Shadow Hawk had chosen desperation as his weapon. He would fight all or nothing, seeking to force Kaelen into a single, decisive engagement. Kaelen did not panic. He had anticipated this, and every valley, ridge, and forest had been prepared. Troops moved into position under cover of dawn mist, cavalry concealed behind hills, infantry braced along choke points, archers hidden in trees and behind rocky outcrops. Hidden caches of weapons, food, and intelligence ensured that no movement was wasted, no opportunity lost. The Emperor had spent decades teaching his men that patience, preparation, and discipline could triumph over raw strength. Even in the face of an enemy that seemed unstoppable, the Shadow Hawk, confident in his numbers and the desperation of his move, advanced into a valley that seemed wide and open. But Kaelen had anticipated this perfectly. Archers on the ridges unleashed a storm of arrows that darkened the sky, halting the enemy advance. Hidden cavalry charged from flanks, striking the northern warriors in wedges designed to split and confuse them. Infantry held lines in strategic choke points, ensuring that every step forward by the Shadow Hawk's forces came at a crushing cost. The psychological impact was immediate. The northern warriors, trained to fear nothing and strike quickly, began to hesitate. Kaelen's forces, disciplined and patient, maintained perfect coordination even under relentless attack. The Shadow Hawk attempted repeated feints and flanking maneuvers, but Kaelen had anticipated each, turning them into traps. The enemy momentum collapsed under the weight of coordination, precision, and strategic foresight. Then came the decisive moment. Kaelen led his elite cavalry in a full wedge charge, the culmination of years of preparation and patient observation. Arrows darkened the sky, horses thundered across the valley, and infantry pressed forward, closing every avenue of escape. The Shadow Hawk, realizing too late that he had been lured into a perfect trap, attempted a desperate breakout. But every move was anticipated, every path blocked. His warriors fought bravely, but the weight of discipline and strategy was irresistible. The final clash was cataclysmic. Steel met steel, horses screamed, and the air was filled with the roar of battle and the cries of the fallen. The Shadow Hawk, striking at the heart of Kaelen's formation, found himself countered at every turn. Elite cavalry met him head-on. Archers struck from all angles, and infantry sealed gaps before he could exploit them. The northern leader's desperate charge was shattered, his forces routed, and his legend, once feared across the land, was finally broken. Kaelen did not pursue recklessly. He allowed survivors to retreat, understanding that mercy and patience were as vital as force in securing lasting control. The Shadow Hawk vanished into the mountains one last time, but without an army, without support, and without the ability to challenge Kaelen again. The war for the Northern Territories, decades in the making, was finally over as Kaelen surveyed the battlefield. The weight of years of patience, planning, and strategy became clear. He had turned myth against myth, endurance against aggression, and intelligence against desperation. The northern clans were subdued, the remnants of rebellion scattered, and the empire secure. His soldiers, exhausted but disciplined, celebrated quietly, aware that they had witnessed a campaign and a confrontation that would be remembered for generations. The Shadow Hawk would become a cautionary tale, a symbol of ambition undone by patience, preparation, and intelligence. Kaelen, through his endurance, foresight, and unbreakable discipline, had not merely won battles. He had secured a legacy. The northern lands were at peace, not through fear alone, but through the mastery of strategy, psychology, and the relentless, measured application of power. And so, the story ends, not with a sudden burst of glory, but with the quiet, overwhelming triumph of the mind over myth, of discipline over desperation, and of patience over chaos. Kaelen, standing on a ridge overlooking the valleys he had secured, understood the truth that had guided him for decades. That true power is not seized in moments of rash action, but earned in the patience, endurance, and mastery of strategy that allows one to strike at precisely the right moment. And when that moment comes, it is unstoppable,